Hello and welcome to Girmit Talks, a series of Nutkhut debates and discussions. Today we're in association with Ameena Gafoor Institute for the Study of Indentureship, and we welcome you to Going Somewhere, celebrating women of Indian-Fijian heritage. We've brought together a panel of speakers to highlight our current project, Girmit, and celebrate the work of women of Indian-Fijian heritage. My name is Anjina Bagwandine. I'm a lawyer and a Nutkhut associate. Nutkhut is an award-winning international arts and heritage company based in London, led by two British Asian artists, Simi Gupta and Ajay Chabra. As an ideas-led, we create work mixing performance, dance, film, and participation. Often inspired by historical people and places, Nutkhut productions are designed to encourage public participation and interaction. Nutkhut tells universal stories that lift the spirit, bringing people together to celebrate and a shared experience with mischief and humor. I will chair this partnership event. This discussion will focus on celebrating women of Indian-Fijian heritage and will feature presentations and readings by Nutkhut's Learning and Engagement Manager, Ellie Newland, artist Shivanjani Lal, economist and activist Dr. Faiza Shaheen, and journalist Rebecca Singh. For further information, head to www.girmit.world or contact Louise Green, project manager. Contact details are on the website. First up, we have Ellie Newland. Ellie will highlight the work of Nutkhut are doing to create a learning toolkit for the project Girmit. Ellie Newland is the learning and engagement manager for Nutkhut. Ellie plays a central role in developing the learning and engagement activity for Nutkhut and our various projects that incorporate educational outreach. Thank you, Ellie.
Thank you, Anjina. Okay, I'm going to attempt to share screen, so hopefully this will go beautifully well. Bear with me. Hang on. Sorry. Share screen. Can you see my screen now?
We can see it. Thanks, Ellie.
Yay! Okay, so I think I'm really just here to kind of introduce the project in a little bit more depth and explain what we've been working on. So I think this has already been covered, a little bit about who are Nutkhut, which you can see on the screen there, so I won't go over that. I'm going to keep my bit short. But one thing that we're passionate about as an organisation is uncovering hidden histories. So actually, this project that we're doing at the moment, Girmit, is the third in a series of 3 defining moments series. The first being Dr. Blighty in 2016. And I expect most of you recognise this building here, which is in my hometown of Brighton, which is the Royal Pavilion. And in 2016, I am not exaggerating to say that we pretty much brought the centre of Brighton to a standstill with these wonderful projections as part of Brighton Festival, which were exploring the role of Indian soldiers in the First World War. Obviously, thousands, in fact, over 1 million Indian soldiers fought in the First World War. And then several of them actually found their way bizarrely to this palace in the middle of Brighton, where they were treated, so it was kind of like a hospital for wounded Indian soldiers. So we wanted to really bring the outside of that building to life with their story, because we felt not enough people knew about that story. And the funny story about it is that the mayor of Brighton was on holiday at the time and had to be called to say, what should we do? Because all these people are flooding into the centre of Brighton to come and see this projection. We're worried about health and safety, and it was all quite stressful, but it was very, very successful. Then a couple of years later, we did Never Set Eyes on the Land, which explored the partition of India in 1947. And here, even though it doesn't look like it, you're actually looking at the inside of a shipping container. And this shipping container, I'm not sure if anybody saw it, but it travelled around through all the Mellors in London. And it was basically representing somebody's home in India that had just had to leave all of a sudden to kind of cross that border. And it was a really, really powerful piece. And I should say, as part of these projects as well, we worked very closely with the community. So with community groups and also with school groups that helped really kind of shape the content of everything, really. So this is the third in that Defining Moments series, Girmit. So you can see Maria there with some sugarcane at Kew Gardens. And the other woman, I believe, is Lorna, who is one of our, she's our kind of lead VR artist on the project. So I'll just explain a little bit about what we've been up to over the last 12 months, which, as you might imagine, has been quite challenging and certainly a very different way for me to work. As a learning and engagement manager, I like to be out there with people, and I've mostly just been sitting in this chair in my bedroom, so it's been very different. So this is what we've been up to. I can't see that completely, but anyway, so it's a Heritage Lottery Fund partnership between Nutkhut, the National Archives and Kew Gardens. So the National Archives obviously are on board as our archive partner. So they've enabled us to do lots of research, and Kew Gardens are on board because of that link with sugarcane. And it's not an academic project. It's not a research project. It is largely a performing arts project. So it's a multidisciplinary project involving artists and professionals from a range of different backgrounds. So obviously we do have Maria, who is our academic lead, but we've also got people with acting backgrounds. We've got a virtual reality artist. We've got a soundscape artist. We've had a web designer heavily involved. We've got a graphic, illustrator, a Fijian illustrator involved as well. So lots of different kind of specialisms all kind of thrown into the mix. We carried out a series of oral history recordings of conversations with descendants of indentured labourers, and we have arrived at a website featuring a 360-degree immersive VR experience. So you can kind of step into those sugarcane fields with a headset and kind of experience that world in 360 degree. A series of multi-dimensional digital heirlooms, with this idea that many of those heirlooms themselves, those things that would have been passed down from generation to generation, have been lost, which is quite often the way. So the idea of recreating those digitally and starting those conversations in a different way. A graphic novel, which you can see the beautiful front cover of that novel on this slide. We've also done an introductory resource for teachers, which is live on the website, which is girmit.world. And I am currently working on a more kind of comprehensive cross-curricular toolkit, largely aimed at Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3, which is the top of primary and the bottom of secondary. So here are just a few pages from the initial intro plug and play resource. So my kind of strong feeling about it, particularly with this age group, is the facts and the figures are less important than emotional engagement with it. So that's more kind of the route that we're going. So that's just a few pages, but you can see the whole thing if you're interested on girmit.world. And then I'm currently working on quite a chunky, or probably about 32-page learning toolkit, which this is actually changed because it's very much in development at the moment. But here is a rough idea of some of the things that you'll find within that toolkit. So it has a little bit of background in terms of how to use a VR headset, because we've got these kind of cardboard ones that are very, very cheap that we can send out to people and things, so that it's easier and more accessible for people to immerse themselves in this world. We have Lali's story and Sati's story. So these are two indentured labourers that we found out about through our research. Then we've got some historical background, asking just key kind of questions about, you know, what it is, a timeline, and then we have cross-curricular learning activities. So you can see that they span lots of different curriculum areas. So we've got spiritual, moral, social and cultural, history, English, drama, art, and geography, largely activities. And then there'll be a section on at the end as well to enable people to find out more. So it is still a project that's going, and we still want to speak to people, and we still want to involve more voices. So if you would like to get involved, or if you have any advice or anything like that, please go and check out the website, which is girmit.world, and give me a shout on email. My email address is up on the screen. All right, thank you very much. I'll stop my share.
Thank you, Ellie. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you. Next up, we have Shivanjani Lal, artist, in conversation with curator Grace Anazia Ali. I'll hand you over to Grace and introduce Shivanjani. Thank you, Shivanjani and Grace.
Good morning.
Morning. Morning.
Shivanjani, first let me just have a little fangirl moment with you and your work. It speaks to me as, of course, as a curator. It's so stunning and gorgeous, and really speaks to me on a very personal level as well. And for those of you watching, please go to Shivanjani's website and see these beautiful installation shots, particularly two bodies of work that I wanted to tell you that I'm just really, really struck by are Palwar and Yad Karo. And the ways in which you're using materials, Haldi and Masi, and the ways that you're thinking about your own family photographs as part of your work, which is a question I want to ask you later. But I was just really, really struck by those two pieces, and I just wanted to thank you for putting them out in the world and making them. They're really
Oh, thank you so much. Like, I feel like Yadkaro and Palwar are very special to me. Like, their Yadkaro was actually predominantly made in India when I was spending time there between 2017 and 2018. And it was one of the last works that I made in India. And I guess I was looking at the ships that moved across from India to Fiji. And so really Yadkaro is well, I guess reflecting on Girmit history, but also Yadkaro was about asking this question, like, do you remember, and or can you remember? And also, like, that the question was for audiences as well as for me. And I think, like, in many ways, I didn't grow up knowing much about Girmit history. I left Fiji when I was 2.5 years old. If anything, I connected to my family's farm. My Aji we still have a farm in Fiji, and we still go there on holidays. But I would not have connected it to plantation histories. I didn't connect it to plantation histories until much, much later. And I can understand why that is. My parents came to Fiji, like Australia, when I was 2.5, but they had 4. I was one of 4 kids. And so they were just like in survival mode. And so they're not thinking about connecting us to this sort of cultural understanding of where we come from and how we got here. But I was always like really curious as to why we were Indian, but not like from India. And I guess in sort of having that first conversation with myself, trying to explore, and then also being in India, kind of going, hang on, you know, I know what this history is, but this isn't my history, and trying to explore the questions around how people, some people got to leave and others got to stay, and also how do you account for that history? Like, I think, like, you know, the thing about the work is that it begins with a map, and that map, which you can kind of see up here, is wait there is a map called the Australian Hemisphere, and it centers Australia. And I think one of the critical things to understand about Girmit history in the context of Australia is that, or like the Asia Pacific, is that the sugar went to Australia and New Zealand, and also some of the labor laws that that enabled Indians to remain in Fiji were Australian labor laws. That also stemmed blackbirding, which is when South Sea Islanders were removed and made to work on sugarcane plantations in Queensland. And so there is this deep interconnected history. And so using a map that is called Yadgar is basically a series of stitched maps. I should probably describe the work from 18, like, and each map, it goes from 1879 to 1920, and there's a series of stitched maps that count all of the ships that moved over carrying Indians from India to Fiji. And it was just a way to kind of acknowledge this movement of bodies, but also they're all hand stitched. So it was about labor, but also there's something about piercing the wood, like piercing something like paper and the fragility of that, and but also like this act of stitching is used in medicine and is suturing, and so it has this capacity to also heal, which I think was really important. But yeah, like I think that work is deeply important to me, because I feel like it was one of the first works that I felt was moving towards acknowledging a history that I had not seen be represented.
It shows. I mean, it shows that the work is deeply personal to you, and I love the stitching gesture, and you know, to mark that number 86 ships that crossed
87.
87 that crossed the Kalapani with that stitching and that embroidering is a really profound. I wanted to ask you quickly. This is actually something that I've been thinking about, and I was wondering about you too. So much of us that work in the diaspora, and our work is about the diaspora, requires us to be in the diaspora. And we haven't been able, you know, to do that. I haven't been able to be in Guyana for over a year. I know that year in India meant a lot to you. And so I'm wondering, first, how are you, and how are you able to navigate that distancing, that isolation, both personally and the impact on your practice?
So right now, I'm usually in Australia, but right now I'm in London, and I am surrounded by a lot of the things that I've been carrying with me over the last 3 or 4 years. So I guess that has been super helpful. I'm in the middle of doing my master's, and so like this research has sort of and I like originally the research, I was supposed to go to India, like I was supposed to go home, I was supposed to go to Fiji, and then I was supposed to go to India, and then I was supposed to come here to London, and then I was going to do my master's. And because all of that kind of blew away, I just decided to bring all of the things that that I wouldn't have brought normally, and just really lean into sort of material making. And and so, I mean, you can't see it here, but in front of me is a series of images of my grandmother from her photo albums that I've had reprinted. There's a horizon of Korotongo, because that's where my family lived when we were in Fiji. So it's really like, it's beautiful to see the ocean. And like, this is like the things that are like giving me great comfort while I'm here, you know, but also I am still planning to go home at some point, and hopefully I will be able to sort of also return, like, and continue to do this type of work. I think also, it's, I guess also like, I'm comforted by the fact that many people are doing different types of labor in terms of this research, and so you know, I'm conscious that I don't necessarily want to be a singular voice. And also, before I came to the UK, I sort of, I guess, invested in other curatorial projects and things that supported community, like in Australia, to kind of continue having conversations. So last year I sort of curated an exhibition called Bittersweet, and I also was in a collaborative show with Cynthia Morney Simpson, who is I guess a Girmit artist from South Africa. And so our collaboration was about sort of broadening my research into broader Girmit histories, not just from the Asia Pacific. And then Bittersweet was an exhibition with Indigenous and Indo-Fijian artists, and that was sort of an ongoing project from 2019. And I think those things really set the tone and the foundation for like my intention for coming into this research, and also sort of giving myself permission to kind of go, I've done the groundwork for my community. I'm allowed to sort of move in multiple directions now. Yeah, I mean, but like, I'm also have spent most of this year in lockdown, so I'm like, and my studio has been like a safe space, and so I have spent an enormous amount of time here because it's in walking distance to where I live.
I love the visual you just gave us of you being surrounded by these images of your family. And you know, so many times, especially for those of us doing work on Guyana, on Fiji, on indentureship, the archives really fail us more than they show up for us. And so many of the stories that we are trying to excavate and tell, we don't have the documentation, we don't have the archives to go to. And even if we have a little bit of archival material to go to, those stories are misrepresented, they're undertold, they're wrong, they're incomplete. And what I really love about your work is that you are turning to your own family's collection and your own personal archives as an archive, as an official document. And I'm curious, that's not an easy thing to do. I'm curious, what's the emotional terrain of that for you to go into your own family's documents and your own family's personal collection, your family's images, and negotiate with that on a personal level? The piece that you did about your grandmother is really, really poignant and touching, but also have to slip into, you know, that artistic curatorial part of your mind, and then think about making and creating from that personal place.
So I make work for both my grandmothers, both my Aji and my Nani, and they've both passed away now. They both passed away in 2003, and in 2012, my mother gave me a photo album, and it was my Nani's, and it was a huge gift, you know, because I was in my final year of art school. I was trying to figure out what it was that I wanted to do. And art school in Australia, and certainly here in Europe, is really wide. And I knew I wasn't making things that were important. I mean, I was making stuff, and I was kind of happy with them, but I didn't feel connected to it. And I was really struck by this image, which is of my nani, and it's the basis of the first video work that I made. And when I made that work, it felt like mine, you know, like it felt like a language that I understood, that felt like it honored her and my relationship with her, and it felt like I was coming home in many ways. But in terms of, I guess, your question of like navigating the archive, like I think it's always like a push-pull, you know, like some days I'm like, I'm really great at doing this. And then there are other days where I'm like, I hate everything. But also like, I think one of the things that I've learned recently is to give myself permission, to give myself time. And also like, you know, this archive comes with a caveat of I don't get to hear who these people are because my mother doesn't know who they are really, and my nanny has been gone for a very long time now, and so while I have these incredible images and they're really beautiful, they come with the loss of the stories. And so for me, like there are some real critical kind of trajectories. My nani and my nana were both teachers, and so weirdly there are images of her sort of going like in teaching college, I assume, but there's also like my nana in sort of like, you know, a very classical traditional teaching sort of school photo. So this, I think, will be one of the next bodies of work that I make from Girmit to teacher, because there is this sort of line or trajectory of Girmitya seeking education, or I don't know if that's the right terming, but like this use of education for betterment. And I'm super fortunate that these images reflect that. That knowledge, but it's still a learning curve. But I'm also really conscious that as an artist of color, like I like maybe I'm only allowed to make identity work, and I think there are times where I'm like there are times where I certainly want to rebel against that, but also like I'm really conscious that I'm one of the first people from my community who are doing this type of work. And so there is like a real responsibility to that. And I feel responsible for that, but I'm also really conscious that there are other people doing it, like Manisha Anjali, who's an incredible writer, Kashil Charans and Cynthia Mohani Simpson, who I've mentioned before, Shiraz Beju. All of these people are doing like incredible work in and around Indenture, and like Mohani Chandra as well. Like all of these people are doing amazing work, and I'm, you know, my responsibility is equally to make sure people understand that I'm not the only voice, but there is a multitude of voices around doing this type of work as well.
You know, Shivanjani, when the archives fail us, one of the things that I know, I believe, one of the things I'm always trying to impart on my students is that embrace the questions, because there are times when the questioning is actually more important than the answers. And the questions actually reflect more about us, because it shows what exactly are you questioning and why are you questioning that. And so what I found is I just move the questions to the forefront. I may not have the answers, and the archives certainly aren't going to give us the answers. So I just elevate the questions, and the more questions I think to use as the foundation for the making and the creating, I know that's always served me well. But it's so important that we elevate those questions and we respect those questions.
Yeah, like definitely. And I also think about how can these questions seed futures, you know, like how can they open up the horizons for us? I think sometimes some of the questions I have for myself personally about just using this personal archive is that what does it actually show of my relationship to Fiji? And so I've actually started taking Polaroids every time I return. This becomes my own archive. We have a farm that's in Fiji at the moment that is sort of slipping away from us, and I'm really conscious that at some point this space will no longer be a place that I can go to with confidence. And so I'm collecting images, but I'm also trying to make images, because I think there's a real impetus for me to kind of create my own archive and have a responsibility to that. And also like Fiji is changing, and so like how do I respond to that? I when I was there last 2 years ago, I my uncle, my mama was on the side of the road in Bar just trying to grab a ride, and we weren't supposed to see him, but we picked him up, and he was kind of shocked, but he was excited to see my mum, and he was on his way to FSC, Fiji Sugar Company, and he started sharing this story that really I still think about. And he was like, you know, he's a cane worker, but none of his children want to be cane workers, which is like totally allowed, like is a reasonable thing. But then there was this moment where he was like, but I just don't know what's going to happen next. And I realized in that conversation and him saying that in his parting, there will be a history that disappears. And for me, it made me realize that in focusing too much on the archive, we miss this contemporary moment as well. And the importance that actually, you know, like these men still exist, you know, these Girmit, like Girmit still exist, and that there isn't like historicizing them actually might be doing them a disservice, you know. And so this is like a critical question that I've been asking myself. I'm not sure if I'm doing it right, you know, like, and I'm, you know, to be honest, I'm never sure if I'm doing it right, but, you know, I'm trying.
Our time is so short, but our time is up. But I wanted to end with just sharing that what you said about, as we work in the past and as we work in the archives, what they reveal to us about a future self, about our future lives, is so critical, that we're thinking about both simultaneously. We're thinking about the past, but we're also thinking about how it reflects in our future. And I just wanted to reiterate that. And thank you so much. It's such a joy to be in conversation with you, even briefly, and just to share and see the connections between what you are doing in service to Fiji and what so many of us are doing also when we think about Guyana and indentures history with Guyana. So thank you, Shivanjani, for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shivanjani, and thank you, Grace. A lovely conversation between you. And next up, I'd like to introduce Rebecca Singh. She's going to be doing a pre-recorded reading called Going Somewhere. Rebecca's a journalist and TV presenter. She's currently the program editor for Al Jazeera. Thank you.
Hi there, everybody. My name is Rebecca Singh, and I'm very sorry I wasn't able to join you today live. I've had to work, unfortunately. But I just wanted to wish you all the very best for today, and maybe one day in the near future we might be able to get together and meet properly. And I'd like to say thank you to Maria as well for the opportunity to contribute to the collection, to write my story, and to share a little bit of the impact that indenture and migration have had on me and my life, and also the life of my parents and everyone before them. So I I feel very honoured to have been asked to do this, and I'm now going to read from the story Going Somewhere, and I hope you like it. The Piccadilly line during a pandemic, usually heaving with people, but today I'm the only person in the carriage, which is rocking gently back and forth, empty seats bearing silent witness to an unprecedented time. It is while sitting here alone that I realise my first encounters with London have always been by the Piccadilly line. First, as a 5-year-old emerging from Leicester Square Station in the stinging cold of late January, the lights from the massive television installation at Piccadilly Circus warming my face. And years later, when I returned to live here, the Piccadilly line again ferried me from Heathrow Airport to my new home in North London. Weighed down by jet lag, I silently observed the people around me. A Muslim woman in hijab sitting next to a heavily tattooed man in his early 20s. Next to him, an elderly West Indian woman knitting, sitting shoulder to shoulder with an older man in a pinstripe suit reading the Financial Times. People with nothing in common, juxtaposed in motion and with the common goal of going somewhere. It dawned on me that it didn't matter who you were above ground. Down here, you were just someone sitting sideways on a lightly foamed chair, going somewhere. And at that moment, for the first time in my life, I felt like myself. I'm able to live in London because my mother is British, but the reason I'm here at all is I come from a long line of people who went somewhere. The story of how I got here began many years before my birth, on ships which set off in 2 different countries, hundreds of years apart. In the 19th century, the ships ferried my father's Rajasthani ancestors to Fiji, where they worked as indentured labourers. After the Second World War, my mother and her family left on a boat from Glasgow, part of a wave of 10-pound poms looking for a better life in the New World. Both lines of my family pushed by the invisible forces of migration to go somewhere, with the hope of finding something better. Those 2 migration streams crossed in the early 1970s in Fiji at the Nadi Airport Club, a social club with a swimming pool and bar for workers at the Nadi International Airport. My mother had flown in from New Zealand on her way to a secretarial contract in the Solomon Islands. My father, who worked at the airport as a communicator, was indulging his interest in the visual, volunteering as the projectionist at the club's monthly movie night. They met at the bar. They were unusual for their time. She was a woman in her early 30s, enjoying the benefits of a life in New Zealand, but she'd made the bold decision to leave on her own for something new and uncharted in Melanesia. My Indo-Fijian father, raised Hindu on the edge of a sugarcane farm in Bar, but educated in a Catholic school and fluent in Latin, had gone against the grain by choosing a career in aviation. Through countless unconventional decisions like this, my mother and father ended up at the airport club that night, with the planes taking off and landing in the background, a sight so loud and magnificent it drowned out the conversation. I grew up with the constant roar of jet planes, the red eyes from LAX, the evening flights from Australia and New Zealand. We lived in housing on the compound adjacent to the airport. Cleaners and janitors were given small box quarters. The larger executive villas with biggish lawns were reserved for expatriates and local managers. The airport children, like my sister and I, went to the Nadi Airport School. The students there were mostly Indo-Fijian and Fijian, but the expatriate children went there too, and a few biracial children like my sister and me. The airport compound was our community, and after independence, the airport it served helped feed the economy. It brought thousands of tourists each year, plus the expatriates who would pilot and fix the planes and manage the hotels and resorts. And it was the airport that reminded us that despite our incredible isolation, Fiji was still connected to the world. Quite often, very important people would come to visit, people like Prince Charles and Diana. My classmates were given the honour of welcoming them. We stood on the tarmac clutching wilting flowers and cheered as they came out of the plane. Another year, it was the Concorde that graced us with its presence. We watched it land and take off and winced and laughed when it broke the sound barrier shortly after. And when Indira Gandhi came on her state visit, my father was presented with a pair of cabin slippers, allegedly retrieved from under Gandhi's Air India seat by one of the aircraft cleaning crew. The plastic seal was broken, so she must have worn them. The airport compound was a zone of transients, where people came and went like the tides. The irony was, as a Fiji citizen, it was never that easy to leave. Once, people with bright blue Fijian passports would have been able to go to Australia and New Zealand as they wanted. But some overstayed a few too many times, lingering longer than they should, and the privileges soon dried up. For Fijians, it became harder to go anywhere, and harder still after the first military coup in 1987, when Fiji was shut out of the Commonwealth. A simple holiday to visit relatives in Auckland or Brisbane required a mountain of paperwork, including evidence of meaningful employment, bank statements, a clean police record, the willingness to name your first child after someone. The paperwork to migrate was the equivalent of a thesis, and the social status awarded to those who had passed this test was immense. Hundreds of people would show up to see off a single family. To have gotten as far as the check-in desks was in itself a victory. As a family, we left on those planes perhaps more than others. Through his work, my father had forged friendships with people all over the world. He was part of a Pacific wireless network that allowed us to meet people from Papua New Guinea to Wellington, and he travelled a lot because of his work in the Union and Rotary. My mother's family was in New Zealand, and she worked for travel agents and private companies that served the airport, a perk of which was sometimes reduced airfares. But aside from that, most of our holidays were in places taken straight from the pages of tourist brochures, at the grand resort hotels on the Coral Coast, but only in the down season, when they offered locals special reduced rates. These long weekends away were filled with the all-inclusive activities of the sea, snorkeling, kayaking, swimming to the pontoon and back, and after we would comb the shore for signs of life. Electric blue starfish, porcupine-like sea urchins, shy hermit crabs which only emerged from their borrowed shells if you whistled. As idyllic as this was, I sometimes felt a bit like the hermit crabs, occupying a space that was not mine, and nothing made me feel more like that than dinner at the hotel buffet. The walk to the buffet was delightful, though, through modernist walkways and corridors which were adorned with underlit palms and rubber trees. But once in the dining area, the truth was always the same. Aside from the local chief and his family, we were reliably the only locals. The resort workers doted on the real tourists, serenading them with ukuleles, beaming big Fiji smiles which faded as soon as their backs were turned. The bellhop economy, a term I learned in social science, a set of social circumstances where structural inequalities ensure that poor people always serve the rich. This is what it felt like in those hotels, and as a local, I felt complicit. So that was a reading of part of my story, Going Somewhere. I hope you enjoyed it, and again, all the very best, and hopefully meet you all soon.
Thank you, Sarah. Sorry, sorry. Thank you, Rebecca. That was very interesting. Thank you. Our next conversation is between Faiza Shaheen and Maria del Pilar Caladine. Faiza is an economist, writer, activist, and commentator, and Maria is an associate fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies in London, working on the system of indenture in Guyana. Thank you. Over to you two. Thank you.
Hi there, Faiza. I think you're going to read, you're going to treat us to a little bit of your piece first. Is that right?
Yes. Hi, Maria. Hi, everyone. Hi,
Good to see you.
Nice to see everyone. Okay, great. I will just read the first page. So the piece is called Fiji and the Fight for Belonging. I was 22 years old and I had never been to Fiji, the country of my father's birth. It was a country he spoke about constantly, filling our childhood with stories of how, as a boy, he would climb trees to get fresh coconut, swim in the calm blue sea, and walk to school without shoes. The latter story was a segue into telling us how lucky we were. The former stories were to remind us how lucky he was. He would never miss an opportunity to tell us how dull this island of Britain was when compared to his Fiji Islands. And while we, as proud Londoners, would try and defend our home, we were also captivated by my father's memories of what sounded to us like a fairy tale, a place we couldn't even imagine, let alone believe we had a hereditary link to. We knew we couldn't compete with Fiji. Despite his constant gloating about his magical childhood home, my father had never managed to pull the funds together to take my mum, my siblings and I. By the time I was a young PhD student, I had enough of waiting for my father. I sensed it may never happen if I didn't take matters into my own hands. Besides, the biographies of Black and Brown Britons I had read led me to believe that I wouldn't fully understand myself until I understood the countries from which my parents had originated. I had at least visited my mother's place of birth, Karachi, Pakistan, but Fiji was a mythical faraway place which I could claim no experience of. Every time I said I was half Fijian, I would feel like a fraud. I had to do this. It was my coming of age trip. My scholarship money would give me some spending money, and the around the world ticket from the student travel agency known as STA went on my credit card. It took years for me to pay it off, but of course there were no regrets. Paradise is priceless. Since this trip, I have only been able to visit Fiji one more time, but in traveling the miles between London and where my dad lived in Suva, I also made a spiritual and political journey. I connected the dots between the British Empire, my life, and the political ideology of the UK today. Fiji is very much part of my politics. I, like so many children of immigrants, battle for belonging in the UK, a country that erases our history and tells us to be grateful about that erasure. Fiji has come to symbolize so much that I am angry about: the lack of acknowledgement of Britain's imperial history, of why people like me are in the UK, or the responsibility it has to the rest of the world because of its historic role in driving poverty, inequality, and environmental degradation, as well as in dividing populations, drawing borders and pitting groups against each other, generating centuries of conflict. Talking about Fiji for me is not just about fighting for belonging here in the UK or telling my ancestors' stories of exploitation. It is about recognizing this history and connection so we can right the wrongs of the past through the UK's policies in the present. The past must be written into our approach to immigration, development, and climate justice today, as well as our understanding of British and global community and interconnectedness. The battle for recognition of our intertwined history and the rights of Fijians in British society is a painful but necessary one. If we, the few children of Fijian immigrants that have the familial memory of indentured labour, fail to take a stand now, the truth will be buried for good.
Faiza, thank you so much for that beautiful reading, and thank you so much, not just to you, but to Grace also, because you both got up at silly o'clock to join us from New York. I hope that the two of you are going to have a chance perhaps to meet up, as you're both in the same city. Thank you so much for that. I loved reading, that was just an excerpt of your piece, but I loved reading it. I particularly loved the way you traced throughout the chapter your relationship with your dad, and how his history, his heritage influenced you. And I wanted to ask you if your dad, because you kind of portray this idea that he was ambivalent about Fiji, and I wanted to ask if he ever spoke to you about indenture and colonialism in Fiji.
He did. So my dad was a very kind of politically minded. He was a car mechanic and had experienced lots of racism in coming to the UK, but he also had this very big interest in following different struggles, often around race and racism around the world. And he did speak about our history quite a lot. And I think that's probably why I always felt so confident. He made out that we, don't ever feel like you that you should question your belonging here, because ultimately we have been paying taxes to this country for centuries. And he did speak about indenture, although I didn't know a lot about it until later on in life. I didn't know the journey that my great grandmother had taken from India to Fiji until I took that trip to Fiji, actually, and family members told me about what happened. But otherwise, I kind of knew a rough understanding, much more of the Brits and Fiji and the empire connection rather than our kind of heritage of picking sugarcane.
Can I ask you, I kind of feel like, I feel some, you know, when I was reading this chapter, it echoed for me a sense of my first visit to Guyana. And I like you, I kind of had to be the instigator of that trip. My dad eventually came back with me, but what it reminded me of, the way you spoke about this desire or this need to return to understand yourself, I remember coming back and feeling a sense of rootedness that perhaps I didn't have before. Was it the same for you after that first visit? I know you've been back subsequently, but did you feel more of a sense of belonging? I know you understood that history of empire and colonialism, but did you feel more of a sense of belonging here, having gone there?
Yeah, I felt more entitlement, I guess. You know, like my dad had always told us, but I think I just felt more entitled to be in the UK and got more irritated by there's something that happened to me. So I ran against the ex-leader of the Conservative Party, Ian Duncan Smith, in the elections in 2019, and in a seat that's always been Conservative. And it was really interesting because people would write his name on my Facebook page and say, vote Ian Duncan Smith, and then put a Union Jack. And I was like, well, why is my name not associated with the Union Jack, right? So my mum's from, my mum's family is from the part of India. They had to travel across because of partition. My dad's from Fiji. We have this long history with the British Empire. The Union Jack is still on the Fijian flag. And yet I'm not allowed to use this, but I would reply back and say, vote Faisal Shaheen and put a Union Jack as well, because I was like, well, no, you're not going to discount me from that. So I do think it was, like I said, I think it just really was quite formative for my politics, to go there and to understand more of the history. And also there's a bit in the piece, as you'll remember, where, you know, when I first got to Fiji, I mean, it's so different to London in like every way. And it was hard for me to kind of connect with it, although I was with family. And I was traveling on this bus one day, and this guy just said, you know, looked at my face for a while and asked if I was from Fiji. And I said, oh, my dad's from here. And he said, welcome home. And I just couldn't, that just never happened anywhere I'd gone in the world. And it was just very, very powerful to me that, you know, that kind of sense of belonging there as well. I think it kind of just extended my sense of belonging in these different places.
Yeah, there's a line, Faisal, I keep coming back to in your piece. Fiji is part of my politics, and I take from that not just Fiji's past, but Fiji's present. So, and by that I refer to the vulnerabilities around climate change. That's also one of your concerns.
Yeah, definitely. I think when you understand that connection, and you look at the way that the UK behaves in the world today, and you don't see that they are recognizing that connection, it's definitely a source of frustration. And the UK owes the rest of the world in lots of ways. And I think through climate in particular, which of course the global south is not, climate crisis it hasn't created, is now having to live through it and worry about livelihoods in their homes. You know, how does the UK then act? What does it spend its money on? How does it connect to Fiji? And so, yeah, it does, I think it just sort of gives you this lens by which to judge UK policy. So I work a lot on policy, and the way in which, you know, I've been in forums where I've watched the UK effectively block efforts to address issues of tax evasion and illicit tax flows from the global south to the west. And it's just, it just makes you very angry in light of that history.
Yeah. I kind of want to just take you back to the piece, that the part that you wrote in your piece about your journey in Fiji on the bus, and kind of this idea of belonging. And I want to ask you how you feel, because you've recently you've recently moved to New York, you've got a position there, and I wondered how you kind of feel about, because when I have spent time away from the UK, it's changed dramatically my relationship with England. And I wonder, just as a final question, how you kind of feel from there, looking over here now, if you feel more of a sense of belonging to the UK, living now in a different country.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because in a way it makes me feel more British, because people always pointing out my accent, and I got told off for saying something about I think I said something about, oh, they would grass you up, and someone was like, can you speak American? What are you saying? What does that mean? Yeah, I do feel I have a very strong like London identity, but you know, I've been in New York for a little while for work. I think, yeah, it can make you feel more of a sense of belonging, but it also, you know, I kind of partly came here because I was so involved in the UK, and it was in terms of the politics, and it was just, I found it increasingly stressful.
Sure.
And coming here was to just get a little bit of distance and to be able to see it from here. But it's only really, you know, I thought it would give me some context and, you know, be able to put it in context, but it actually has made me feel a bit worse about the direction things are going. But it also reminds me that, you know, I have a role in trying to change that.
Faiza, thank you so much. I'm sure we're going to have some. I'm sure we're going to have some questions for all of you. So can I just announce to all the attendees, if you have any questions at all for Shivanjani, Faiza, Grace, we'd love to take them. And what I can set, so I've got a Q&A box here. So if you just pop your questions in my Q&A box, we would all love to kind of hear from you. While I'm waiting for those, if you don't mind, guys, I just wanted to ask you another question. Grace was talking about fangirling earlier on with Shivanjani, and I am your fangirl, and I have tremendous admiration for you, and oh my gosh, is my Gina Miller, how could I forget her name? It's my countrywoman. And I see you both kind of in the public eye and on TV, so well presented, so calm, and dealing with, I know that you both deal with some really unpleasant trolling on social media. And I had an opportunity to interview Gina Miller a while ago, which, as a descendant of indentured labourers, whenever I get a chance to speak to other women who share that history, particularly women in the public eye, I feel an immense sense of pride. And I asked her I asked that, you know, in view of the fact that you do have these experiences, and you do both get a lot of racism directed at you, I wonder, what does self-care mean for you? How do you how do you turn down the volume on that when it happens in public life?
Honestly, I was just thinking, listening to Grace and Shivanjani on this, and just actually draw a lot of strength from other people, people also trying to, in different ways, get the message out there, provoke different thinking, tell our stories, and drawing strength from other people in the struggle in that way. It's really the most helpful thing for me. Yeah, like it's helpful to just watch a bit of trash TV and not look at my Twitter for a while. And my husband might want to, you know, check it out and make sure that I don't check it. But I think for me that's the place that I kind of draw strength from, especially other women of color, I have to say, that I find very energizing.
Yeah, that's awesome. I've got a question in the chat here. Oh, it's just saying thank you very much. Thank you so much for these wonderful presentations. Curious if any of you from Fiji see reflection of the caste system in your present environment. Does anybody want to take that? Or anybody interested in?
I guess I can. I, having spent time in India and have friends who are Dalit artists, I feel like it's really important to lift up voices from that community. And because I grew up in diaspora, and I also didn't grow up identifying as with caste because I left Fiji when I was 2. I find it really hard to navigate conversations about caste because caste has come into my life much later. So I think for me, prioritizing people like Kirtika Kane, Yogesh Barva, I'm working with a really wonderful young Amol K. Patel. Like, these are people to be championing. But in the context of Fiji, I do know other people who are looking into that a little bit more. But like, it's a bit like, I mean, yeah, like it is tricky to be like I think it's a really important conversation to be having, and I'm trying to navigate it the best that I can. But it's also like it's like I you know, like I'm also a very privileged person who's like managed to like move through the world in a very different way to how I would be if I was still attached to a type of caste, if that makes sense.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much, Shivanjani. If there's any more questions, please do pop them in the Q&A. And I did want to say to the panelists, if you have questions for each other, please don't feel restricted. just jump right in. I think I've got another question coming through here, but do go ahead.
I actually wanted to bring up that point on caste. So I was brought up a Muslim, Eid Mubarak to people who are celebrating, and so the caste question never, it was actually something I learned about like later on in life. But one thing I do notice with my Fijian family versus my Pakistani family is on my Fijian side, they see me as like light skinned, and therefore like all of the colorism points in South Asian culture come up very strongly. In my Pakistani family, I'm seen as dark skinned and a Fijian, and you know, and it was always very interesting to me, like ideas of beauty in those two different communities and the color of my skin and how much that would come up. And we know that unfortunately we do have this, you know, system of beauty that just seems to take lighter skin as a sign of being more beautiful. But I definitely have noticed that, and then in its own way it creates a hierarchy, right?
Sorry, you've got some lovely feedback, ladies, that's coming to me in the from the attendees. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to save that for you. And I've just got a couple last questions in the Q&A. I mean, the answer to this is no. I can tell you that as a historian of indenture. So were indentured labourers picked by their darker skins to leave? No, is the answer to that. Indentured labourers were selected, recruited, duped, inveigled by a number of recruiters, and none of that was based on skin colour. Ladies, I want to say to each and every one of you, it is a real pleasure and a privilege to have this conversation with you. It's so rare that we have an opportunity to have a panel and a meeting of just women, and it's very special for me to have the opportunity to be in conversation and listen to so many women that I look up to. So I'm really grateful to you for joining us this morning. And for making this event possible.
Well, Maria, thank you. We show up at 4 a.m. and 5 a.m., right, Faiza, because of you and how much we appreciate all of the incredible work that you are doing and your leadership in this work, Maria. So thank you for gathering us and for always gathering us. We appreciate you and the work of the Institute so much. Thank you, my dear.
Thanks, Grace. I love what Shivanjani was saying when she was talking about, I wrote that down. She was talking about everybody kind of working together. And sometimes there are moments where it feels as though only one person or two people are seen. And I love this idea, Shivanjani, that you want to show kind of a global diaspora of indentured labourers, descendants of indentured labourers, all kind of working together and pushing out work, pushing out writing. Because for me, that's very much how it feels, and it's a wonderful thing to be a part of.
Yeah, I mean, I think that conversation has stopped me from feeling really isolated and knowing, because I think that these are conversations that are mirrors, you know, like my mentor here in London is Shiraz Beju, and he's a Mauritian British artist, and like we met in India, like really, really strangely. And the minute that we started talking, we had this shared history that we understood. And you know, Mauritius is one of the first countries that received indentured labor, and so really I can't be like it seems ridiculous not to sort of be in conversation with him, and similarly not to be in conversation with Cynthia, because it is a global conversation, you know, and it is also like, you know, I think the number is like 3 million people were sort of displaced, and yet that number's never been accounted for. Not, I mean, and I just feel like, yeah, my focus is on Fiji, but I'm happy to be part of this broader conversation.
Yeah, that's a wonderful place to leave it. I hope you can all see some of the lovely feedback that's coming up here. Thank you so much, and we'll end it there. And many thanks to all our panelists, and to you, Anjana, for hosting us today.
Well, thank you to all of our participants, and most of all, thank you to all of our viewers. For more information on Girmit, let's go to nutkhut.co.uk or www.girmitworld. But thank you, it's been really good. Thank you.